All right, I think it's time to get started. We are recording. Okay, so we are we're finishing up with our discussion of family issues, I call it, family problems and research on family problems. And so just to refresh our memory, we started with a very functionalist look at divorce as an issue in families. And what made it functionalist was that it was quantitative, looking at lots of data at once, looking at the whole family issue for the whole country, and trying to use, the research process, the quantitative, scientific method to determine if divorce really caused problems. And so for young people. And then we looked at a more symbolic interactionist approach to studying family issues. And that one was much more focused on a particular local community, a neighborhood, and trying to understand why people in that community have a high rate of teen pregnancy. And so it was more looking at the meaning that people attach to their actions and why they do what they do, not just looking at the numbers and trying to figure out which variables are correlated with which other variables. So it was more of a looking at the symbols and meanings that people are using and the ways they perform for each other and put on acts as, in this case, as playas and as mamas too. And so, so that was a very different way of studying people, going up close and personal and living with them for a year. That's very different than crunching numbers in a big database, which is what Kuntz did for the first study. This third, and so we learned a little bit too about functionalism, looking at families as an institution and trying to look at how they function or not. And symbolic interactionists being more interested in how people think and feel and how they interact with each other. So more interested in culture and how it develops and what effects it has on people's behavior. But the third one is from a conflict theory perspective, and it's called the incidence and causes of wife abuse. And this one is by Maxine, Baca, Zinn, and Stanley Eitzen. So again, I'm just trying to not plagiarize. I'm citing my sources. Is there anything in this title, as you look at what they've decided to, this is the title of one of their articles, what about this terminology might lead you to think that these are conflict theorists, not functionalists or symbolic interactionists? The incidence and causes of wife abuse. My evaluation yesterday, they told me to wait longer for student answers. Don't just jump in and answer it. Or that's what she observed when she was here, that I'm too quick to tell you the answer. Anything in there? Any words jump out? Again, there's no wrong answer. Yeah.
Wife abuse.
Okay. Why does that jump out at you?
Because they're maybe trying to figure out like it says right there, causes of wife abuse. They're trying to figure out.
But you're focused on these words. So what about these words? You're right, that's the tip off, that these aren't like other sociologists. They're looking at this in terms of conflict theory.
Because women are being hurt.
Are there other words that, so what were you gonna say?
So maybe it was like, it's conflict between like the husband and the wife, so it's two parties like having conflict.
Right, I mean, are there other ways to describe what this is talking about that would be less like a conflict theorist? Like, what else could you call it when a wife is abused? Are there phrases we use? Remember, one of the ideas of this class was that how we describe things is how we construct them. And when we talked about gender, for example, the passive voice, if you recall from Tough Guys, when you use sort of neutralized terms, neutral, non-gendered terms, then you are looking at the problem in a certain way, but that might not be the most accurate. So this, like you're saying, is more gendered. It's saying there's wife abuse. It's not saying husbands are being abused. wives are being abused, is there a different way to describe that problem that you're aware of? Like, how does the police describe that issue? Do they call it wife abuse, or what do they call it?
Domestic
Hmm?
physical abuse? Physical abuse?
Yeah, but what's the term for that? I mean,
Domestic?
when it's a wife,
I was thinking of domestic.
domestic abuse, spousal abuse, domestic violence,
Yes.
spousal violence. We hear these terms all the time, but those are what we call gender neutral terms. They just make it seem like there's just violence happening. It's also called passive voice. Instead of saying this person's being abused by that one, calling it out, you're just saying there's abuse happening. And conflict theorists and other more critical thinking sociologists would say, well, is that really accurate? I mean, it makes it sound more objective to say domestic violence. But is it accurate? Like, are men as likely to get beat up by women as women are by men? Are children as likely to beat up their mom and dad as dads are to beat up children? I mean, according to this conflict theory view, if we just call it this, neutral sounding name, we're actually misunderstanding the problem. We're deliberately keeping men out of the picture. That was how tough guys put it. When you don't name the men as the abusers, you're letting them off the hook and making it seem like everybody's equally guilty. But a conflict theorist is one who's gonna point out, who's being abused by whom and try to address it that way, not just, again, a functionalist might be more like there is violence in the home and we need to address it, more neutral sounding way. Which again, if you're in the powerful group of a society, keeping things neutral sounding is one way to maintain your power when you start pointing out, well, who is doing what to whom. You could ask the same thing about right now, there's protests going on college campuses, and some people are trying to paint the students as the ones that are violent. On the other hand, it's administrators that are sending in cops to arrest people and suspend people, and so, the way the media describe it is there is violence on campus, there is campus unrest, you use this general sounding term instead of saying administrators are brutalizing students, administrators are depriving students of free speech rights. They don't put it that way. But anyway, so these people do. So Stanley Eitzen aren't gonna dance around the bush, beat around the bush and call it spousal abuse or domestic violence. They're pointing fingers here, and they're saying it's men doing it to women, and if we don't acknowledge that right out off the bat, in their view, we're gonna look at the problem wrong. Like, and tough guys made that point too. Like, if you just say there's violence going on schools, and you start trying to figure out what's causing the violence at schools, then you look at everything, and you're like, oh, we gotta look at video games, whatever it is. But girls play a lot of video games too, and they're not the ones doing the violence. So are you really finding the cause when you do that? I mean, if you name the real perpetrator, men, then you start looking at what is it about being male and masculine in our society that's leading men to act that way. In the same way, they're saying if we call this out as wife abuse, we're gonna look at the problem in a more specific way than if we just call it domestic violence. And so they say that to understand domestic violence, they say we need to understand that the American family is a microcosm of American society. What are they talking about there? Well, what's a microcosm? A microcosm, M-I-C-R-O-C-O-S-M. You might know that term, that word. It means like a smaller version of a larger thing. A micro, small, cosm, cosmos, meaning universe. A small universe. So what are they talking about there? Well, like for example, if you have an aquarium at home with fish in it, and it might be like a saltwater aquarium. It's like a little mini ocean in your house. It's not the whole ocean, but it's like in that little ocean you can get the experience of the whole ocean from that little ocean. And in the same way, they are saying the American family, if you're trying to understand why American families are the way they are, you need to understand American society, because they're like a little mini version of America. all the conflicts going on in America, they say you could kind of understand if you look at a lot of American households. And it's interesting that they call it the American family. I mean, that again sounds like a functionalist. It's referring to the family as an institution, which they are using that terminology. But unlike a typical functionalist, they want to really dig deep into the roots of why there's conflict in the home and not just use this sort of neutral sounding language about it. So what is it about American society? So that's for them, the real question is, what's going on in American society that leads so many American homes to have women and children being beaten up and harmed by the men there? Why is that? And so they say, first of all, we have to understand that America is a violent and patriarchal society. That's a new word for us, patriarchal. Patriarchy is a term lots of people use nowadays. They didn't, I mean, when I was in grad school, only grad students used that term, patriarchy, but now I hear it all the time. Patriarchy means a society run by and for men. Patriarch means father. And not all societies have been patriarchies. There are examples in human history of matriarchies, where the women are more in charge of things. Some conflict theorists say that's how it used to be. That's the normal state of humans, is that you have a tribe of people living together and the men are off hunting a lot of the time. So the women are really in charge of the campsite and the children and the households. And it's only in modern society, some conflict theorists say, when men have taken over because of capitalism and tried to use private property, this idea that it's my home and my castle, that's what led to women being, losing the power over communities and their villages. And so conflict theorists are saying, so patriarchy, to understand why so many men beat up their wives and children, they say you need to understand this concept, patriarchy. And so, but what does incidence and causes mean? We should think about that for a second. Incidence means where and when does something happen. And so they are approaching this a little bit like a functionalist who studies crime. If we look at where and when this thing happens, like a crime, then try to come up with theories about why it's happening there and then. And so that's what they mean by incidents, where and when. And causes, they're trying to understand, like the scientists, as we said, all scientists, whether they're symbolic interactionists, functionalists, conflict theorists, or chemists, physicists, or whatever kind of scientists they are trying to understand, why things happen. So what really makes them conflict theorists is not the incidents and causes, but this term. And so, but they start with the causes. So we'll get to the incidents in a second. But they start with, to understand, and theirs, by the way, isn't really presented as a research study. I should mention that as well. A research study, like we said, starts with a research question and trying to answer it. And they're not really approaching things that way. They're starting with this claim that wife abuse reflects a violent patriarchal society, and they want to convince you of that claim, so they're presenting evidence to support their argument. But that's what we would call an essay. When you write an essay, when you try to persuade people that your view of things is the correct one, that's an essay. A research paper is a different thing. That's where you report. Here's the question I had, here was the data I collected, here was the study I did. So this isn't really a research report, this article I'm talking about. It's more of an essay, and it comes from more of a conflict theory perspective. And that too is kind of typical of conflict theory. Conflict theory is kind of skeptical of science and saying, we're not really scientists, we're social scientists, which means a lot of times we're just trying to convince people of a certain way of thinking. We're not necessarily trying to answer questions totally objectively, because many social scientists would say it's impossible to be objective about society because we as human beings live in it. It's easy to be objective about frogs, or some other things that scientists study that they're not. But when humans study humans, we are the humans studying ourselves, so you can't really be objective about it. And so pretending that you're just doing research, it's just objective research, that is a bit of a pretend thing. It's a pose that sociologists do. Conflict theorists will say, we're not pretending, we're making an argument, we're trying to persuade you that this argument is correct. And so they start with the causes. Why do they think there's so much, violence in the home? It's because we have a violent patriarchal society. But what are they talking about specifically there? The way they put it is that we have institutionally sanctioned violence. Institutionally sanctioned violence. So what does that mean? So we'll help you understand what it means. But institution in their term, just like a functionalist, they're talking about basic institutions of our society, like the family, the school system, the economy, the government. And they're trying to understand how our institutions as a society actually sanction, which means in this case allow or promote or condone, that our institutions actually allow and promote and condone violence. And they think, if we pay attention to that, and make it strange, look at it from here, and we can go, wait, why are we doing it that way? What are they talking about? Well, for example, our laws. Our legal system itself is one that they think helps sanction violence, especially against women and children. Our legal system is based on what's called British common law. So before we had a constitution in this country, remember America was founded by the British, and they brought their legal system over from England, and that's what ran the country until we declared independence and won the war, and then we created a constitution. But our constitution is rooted in British common law, the basic ideas of British common law. And one of the ideas of British common law is what's known as the rule of thumb. You've ever heard that phrase, rule of thumb? People say, oh, that's a good rule of thumb. Oh, that's a nice rule of thumb. What does rule of thumb mean? Well, rule of thumb is when the term means when you don't know the rule for something, like you don't have the rule book in front of you, you can use a good rule of thumb that might not always be true or might not be totally accurate, but it works. Like, a spelling rule of thumb is I before E except after C. I mean, if you really think about English words, there's plenty of examples where the E is before the I, right? But it's a good rule of thumb to say I before E except after C. But it's a rule of thumb. But where did the term rule of thumb come from? Like, what does that mean? It came from the idea that in British common law, it was okay to hit your livestock. You could use, I should have actually mentioned that, first of all, corporal punishment is one of the laws. Corporal means body. Can you use the person's body as the site of punishment? Can you whip them, for example? Can you hit them? Can you hurt their body? And in British common law, you could use corporal punishment on your livestock, for example. And by the way, in this, I should also mention, because I'm kind of out of order here, sorry. In British common law, women were defined legally as chattel. You know what the word chattel means? What does chattel come from? Chattel, what does it sound like? Do you know any other words that sound like chattel? When like out in the farm you have a bunch of cattle. Cattle and chattel are related words. Women had the rights of cattle, the same rights as cattle. So if you were a property owner, a male property owner in British common law, only males could own property, then women in your household were property as well. And the cows in your household are your property as well. They're your livestock. You have dead stock, I guess, or just property, land. And then you have livestock, like these cows, and you have females, and they're chattel. And so anything you're allowed to do to a cow, you are allowed to whip your cow, hit your cow with a stick, and British common law said you are allowed to hit your woman with a stick. How big of a stick can I hit her with? Your thumb. About the diameter of your thumb is what the law said. So yeah, you can use a stick, but you're not supposed to use a club and kill her, but a stick, you can use that, yeah. Learn her a lesson or two with the stick. I don't know if you find that appalling. A lot of people around here, I notice, experience corporal punishment themselves, spanking from their parents. There's a lot of research on that spanking, if you look at spanking as a kid, what outcomes does that lead to? Does that lead to, are you a better person in life because you got spanked? And if we compare the spanked people to people who never got spanked, do we see, I mean, a lot of people will tell you if you don't spank your kids are going to end up in terrible situations. But the research does not support that at all. If we go and look, and I can tell you right now, if you went to Stanford University right now and asked a bunch of Stanford University students, were you spanked as a kid? Is that why you're so successful as a student? You were spanked? A very high percentage at Stanford are going to say, no, my parents never spanked me, never would have spanked me. If I go up to Folsom Prison right now and ask a lot of the guys, the inmates there, were you spanked by your parents? Oh yeah, all the time. Really learned me some lessons. I wouldn't be where I am today if I hadn't been spanked. See what I'm saying? I'm trying to be ironic. But Folsom Prison is not where you want to end up in life, but a lot of the people who ended up there in life were spanked as kids, and a lot of people that end up at Stanford were not. So I don't want to, if you were spanked yourself, I'm not trying to tell you you're headed for anything bad, but in terms of the statistics of it, does spanking lead to good outcomes? I do want to tell you, if you have kids, spanking is not where you want to be with your kids. Physical violence on your kids is not the way to teach them anything. It teaches them that physical violence is a reasonable thing to do to people. That's about all it teaches them. It doesn't have good record of success in teaching people like good work habits, successful studying habits, or anything that makes you actually successful in life. And it has a lot of other negative effects. It makes them fearful, it makes them traumatized, it makes them underconfident, all kinds of things that we shouldn't be hurting children or our loved ones, our wives and stuff. But it was an old-fashioned, I would call it brutish idea from like caveman days that a lot of people still believe in. America's not the most patriarchal society. You know, Russia's worse, and there's plenty of societies around the world today where men think it's their job to brutalize women. But in the places where people have finally kind of grown up as a society and realized you don't need to do that to get people to act right, those places are more successful. I'm talking about places like Northern Europe, you know, Scandinavian countries where people there don't believe in spanking and don't believe in forceful methods of raising people. And they're much more equality in those societies with women and men and children, with adults and that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's my little sermon on the side. Don't be spanking your kids. It doesn't work and it doesn't get you where you want to go. And really it's a sign that you failed as a parent. If you have to spank somebody, then all your other better methods you've given up on and you've gone to that. You don't need to spank dogs either. And I mean, good training of dogs doesn't involve inflicting serious pain on them. The carrot is much better than the stick, as they say. Rewarding people for good behavior is way more effective if you want to get them to act right than punishing them for not doing right. So anyway, but British common law basically said women are property and men who rule them have the right to use violence to control them. And even though we don't have British common law anymore in our society, there's still like remnants of it, you know. The laws nowadays don't say you're allowed to hit your wife with a stick, but there are men who in their mentality still think in terms of, that's my right, that's my duty, she's mine, she's my property, she's my, I mean, people use negative words when they start possessing somebody, like she's my B-I-T-C-H, or she's my whatever. And if you're thinking of something as a person, as somebody you own, you know, you're not going to necessarily treat them in a humane way. They're property, not a person. So they say that still exists in a way in our society. Another related thing, though, is law enforcement laxity. So even though the laws have changed, our law enforcement as an institution has not always done its job in terms of protecting women from domestic violence. And it's partly because of, again, patriarchal notions and practices. So for example, traditionally speaking, the only guys that are cops are men. And when they show up to a home, you know, where there's a domestic situation, as they call it, they don't always see it as a crime. They see it as a domestic situation. A guy's beefing with his wife. But those same officers, if they were to be, you know, patrolling the neighborhood and they saw two men standing there, and one man had a bloody nose and a black eye, and the other man had, you know, red knuckles and blood on his shirt, are those cops going to see it as a crime scene? Yeah, some assault happened here, somebody got bloodied, some violence happened, and it's our job to enforce the law, so we got to find out what happened. On the other hand, when those same cops show up at a home and find a woman with a bloody nose and a black eye and a man living there with red knuckles, they don't always see it as a crime. They see it as, this guy's having a beef with his wife. And even if they don't see it that way, or they try to see it that way, the way our laws are set up is it's not that easy to charge it as a crime. You know, part of our laws is private property. That's a big issue here. In a patriarchal society, private property has always been defined, or traditionally was, as the man's. The man owns it. A man's home is his castle, as people put it. So the idea was, I mean, that's a telling phrase, a man's home is his castle, because we live in a democracy, not a monarchy. So this idea that we live in a democratic society, but in your home, it's a kingdom. And in your home, the dad is the king. And the dad's law rules. And there is no other law. My law is what rules. Why? Because I said so. And what happens when you don't? Don't want to find out. That's not democracy, that's a monarchy inside of a democratic society, and it's almost like the law outside didn't cross your doorstep, like, I have my own laws in here. And if cops won't enforce the law outside in there in your house, then yeah, then the dad is the king. And he doesn't have to listen to law enforcement. And private property laws make it hard for law. Laxity means not really enforcing the law, being lazy about it. But it isn't necessarily laziness, it can be inability to enforce the law. So for example, to cross the doorstep, you have to have a warrant. You can't just as a cop start going in and finding evidence of a crime inside someone's home, because our law says it's private, it's sacrosanct, it's sacred, it's his property, the government doesn't get to start nosing around in your house. But that law protects men who abuse women and children in their home, because it makes it hard for the cops to go and find out. What they need is the woman to say, yeah, a crime was committed against me. But a lot of women don't want to say that, because, why? Because, I mean, we're going to talk about that. But if you think about, why would a woman not want to get the law involved in her home? There's a lot of reasons why she might not. And that doesn't mean that it's okay to beat her up and the children, but it means that we need to, as sociologists, try to figure out what the incidence is telling us. Do we really know who's being beaten up or not? Because if people aren't telling the cops, which most of them don't, then we don't know exactly who's doing it and who isn't. So I'm going to get to that point in a second. But what are some other reasons, other institutional ways that we as a society kind of tell men it's okay, it's right to beat up your wives and children? Our laws seem to say that in some ways. Also, our, guns. We have a gun culture. America's very into its guns and very into with our legal system, this idea that it's your private sacred right to own guns. And it comes in a lot of cases from a patriarchal notion that says it's a man's job to own a gun because it's his job to protect the wife and children from all the harms out there. But again, if we look statistically, are you actually safer in your home if there's a gun there and the man has got guns to protect the wives and children? Are wives and children actually less likely to get shot if there's guns in their home? And the answer is by far no. By far, you're much more likely to get shot by a gun if your man is keeping guns in your house. If you have no guns in your house, your chances of getting shot are very low. So keeping guns in your home doesn't have a very strong record of protecting, like somebody tried to get in the home and the man successfully protected his wives and children with the gun. There's many more cases of they were kept guns in the home and the man got mad and shot people. Or the wife found the gun and shot the husband, or the children got the gun and shot themselves, or shot the dad, or shot the parents. I mean, this idea that you're gonna have the gun in your home and you're gonna keep all these bad people out. I mean, it's a nice thought, I guess, for some men to feel really in charge, but again, statistically, you'd be much safer. And a lot of Americans say we don't want so many guns around. The guns around are the problem. Again, because guns are super lethal. People always get mad at each other, but if all you're doing is slapping your wife around, she's not gonna die. But if you get out the pistol and shoot her in the head, yeah, she's not coming back. So that's what I'm saying. Guns are part of this violent culture in America, and part of this idea that it's part of masculinity. It's a kind of violent masculinity that says it's my job as a man to use guns, and I'm not a real man if I don't have guns. And those people that don't want guns, they're trying to take away my manhood. I mean, it's that whole attitude that leads to a lot of women and children being killed, and men too. I mean, the number one people to probably the number one person to get shot with the guns that men own is the man himself. A lot of suicide by angry white males these days in America. And so we might be wanting to know, why are they so unhappy? But and do they really need all these guns? But anyway, so guns. I'm trying to think of some of the other things that are in my notes. I'm having a little bit of blank. Well, media, violent sports, which is also connected with this construction of masculinity. But they used to say, and I don't know if this is still true, but if you're looking for the incidence of wife abuse, where and when does it happen? They used to say Monday night was one of the big nights for domestic violence, for wife abuse. Why Monday night? What's on TV on Monday night? Football, Monday Night Football, and the idea was men watching Monday Night Football, having a few beers on a Monday night, and their team loses, and they, smack their wives and children around. And so Monday night had this high incidence of wife abuse, and they are saying, I mean, I don't know if it's still true because now they have football on a lot of other nights too, and other violent sports and things, and so not necessarily blaming football, but yeah, I mean, men when they watch sports tend to get, hyped up, and seeing other men brutalizing each other maybe leads men. I mean, I definitely noticed this with myself and with my children. You watch some football or some hockey, and then next thing you want to know, the kids are wrestling and beating the crap out of each other because it looks like fun or something, or it brings out some, hormones or whatever. But but again, it's part of how we construct masculinity. I remember growing up as a young man, seeing football guys being heroes because they really leveled some quarterback and put the guy out, knocked him out. Like, wow, what a great football player that guy is, because he leveled that dude, knocked him out. And my whole childhood, all I wanted to do was knock out some quarterback. And I even had a coach once say, I'll give $5 to any player on this team that injures the quarterback on the other team, put him out of the game. I mean, that's toxic masculinity. That's what we're talking about here, and a lot of our sports are tied up with that kind of toxic masculinity. So they say this is something we need to understand, is the way we construct our men and boys in America, the props we give them in their performances, like guns and violent sports, and the way that legally we seem to tell them it's okay to do this, and that it's right to use people's bodies as the site of discipline. aside from these institutional causes, what else do Baca, Zinn, and Eitzen point to as ways to understand the causes? They say that's also our family structure. Family structure in America, I'll say American family structure, encourages conflict. So they say if you look at how we structure our families, the who has what question when it comes to families, they're set up in a way where maximum conflict is kind of predictable. And there might be other ways to organize families so that people aren't having conflict with each other. What are they talking about? Well, for one thing, if you define the unequal families, a lot of families, the dad has all the power, and the women and children have no power. And dad says, it's my way or the highway. What I say goes. You all have to follow what I say. I'm the king. And that is a recipe for conflict. Again, in a democratic society where we're telling people everybody has rights, everybody has a voice, everybody should have equality. And then in your household, you got some dude saying, no, that ain't happening here. I mean, that's conflict. Like all of a sudden, we're not on the same page. And so certainly that's the case if the woman has no power compared to the male. But even if you have equal parents that share power, if you don't give kids any power in a household, that too is a recipe for conflict. Now, again, am I saying as a democratic dad, I try to have a democracy in my household. What does that entail? In a democracy, do the children have as much say as the parents? I mean, I compare it to an American democracy. As citizens, we don't have as much say as the president. He has more power. But we have a say in who the president is. And what really rules the president is the law. We say we have rule of law. So even if somebody has power, their power is limited by the law, and they can only enforce the law. They don't get to be the law itself. And so it's possible to have family structures that are more democratic, where the children get a say in things. They might not have as much power as the parents, but for example, I'll use one that just recently happened to me. Our dog, we've got this rescue dog, and he keeps biting people. It's like his 5th bite of one of our kids' friends. So my wife just was like, that's enough, we've got to give him away. And so she broke the news to me and my kids, we're giving that thing away. And my kids were mad. They're like, don't we get a say in this, And we kind of walked it back a little bit and saying, okay, well, let's have a family discussion and, work it out as a group, come to some group consensus. But group consensus means, if somebody's ready to get rid of the dog, they have to be on board with wanting the dog too. We can't just group up against my wife and say, you're wrong, we're keeping the dog. So, but yeah, it can be hard to come to democratic decision making, but it's better than just saying, this is what's happening and you have to just accept it. Because then you have conflict. And again, with kids, I would say, if you just try to lay down the rule to them and say, this is the rule and you have to follow it, and if you don't follow it, there's consequences. That's what a lot of parents try to do, and it doesn't work out that well. Because what you don't have is consent of the governed. The idea of democracy is the people themselves agree to be governed by the rules and by the people holding the power, because they've had some say in the rules and the people holding the power. If you get to help vote on the people and you get to help vote on the rules, then you're supposed to say, well, then I accept the rules and the people because I helped to make them. And if I'm not happy with the current rulers and rules, there's a process that I can follow, a peaceful one, to try and change it. I can work on voting, I can create an organization, I can do other things, but I don't have to go get guns and go attack the Capitol and kill the president. Anyway, so that's same with the household. If people have some say in the decision making and get to have their voice represented, then hopefully they agree. And so what I try to do with my kids is get them to agree on the rules. So we say, yeah, you have to have a curfew. You can't just like stay out all night, right? A patriarchal dad would say, your curfew is 9 o'clock, young lady, and if you're not home by 9 p.m., there will be hell to pay. Well, did that method ever work for a dad? Because girls come up with all kinds of ways to fool you or get out, you know. So I'd rather say to my daughters, what do you think is a reasonable time to come home? And if I say 9 o'clock, they say, that's not reasonable. How about, 3 in the morning? And I go, that's not reasonable. What's a reasonable time? If we can come to some compromise that they go, that's reasonable. So like 12, midnight, is that reasonable for a teen girl, 17 years old? Is that reasonable for a dad to be able to go to sleep with a clear conscience and heart? If we can agree on what the fair rule is, and you've agreed to it and I've agreed to it, then we don't have to have conflict all the time over enforcing the rule. Hopefully, we're agreeing to it and you're agreeing to follow it and I'm agreeing to, not come down so hard on you. And, there can be times when people miss the rule by a little bit or whatever, but unequal families have a lot of conflict, and dad is constantly spending all his time making sure everybody's doing what I said, and I'm not gonna lie, I've got my eyes on you. It's a lot of work as a dad to have that patriarchal family, and it doesn't really work because as soon as they get out of your sight, they're gonna go do the things you don't want them doing. So it's better to be on the same page. Let's watch yourself because you agree with the rules. Anyway. So I'm just, again, giving you my sermon on how to be maybe a better dad. I think it's same with management in a workplace. A manager who's like, you better do it the way I say or else you're going to have hell to pay is not a very good manager. A manager who says, I want everybody to agree on the rules so that we're all one team working together is a better manager, in my view. Anyway, so unequal families are one reason. Another issue is that we define the family as a private thing. In America, we say the family's private. It's my private affair. We say things like, don't air your dirty laundry in public, meaning don't tell people what's going on in your private home. People feel ashamed to say, things that are going on. And how does having this idea that what happens in my home is private and is nobody else's business, how does that lead to wife abuse? Can you think of reasons why that happens?
They're ashamed.
They're ashamed, so they don't tell anybody. So it goes on and on for years and they don't want to tell anybody. If you walk by a home and you heard sounds like this and people screaming, "Ah, no!" Would you call the cops? Or would you say to yourself, that's not my business. That's their business. We have this strong feeling like I shouldn't. And again, though, if you saw somebody in the street in public doing that to their kid or their wife, you would call the cops. But we have this feeling like it's private. I can't do anything about that, or I shouldn't do anything about that. It'd be wrong of me. But as long as we define it that way, then again, men are free to do things in the privacy of their home that they would never admit to doing in public, and that nobody in the household would want to admit. So that's one reason why, a lot of women don't want to report it and don't report it, and so it stays private. And so taken together, private families that are unequal, that are surrounded by institutions that support the idea that men should be using violence on people, taking that all together is why they think we have a high rate of wife abuse. But where and when does it happen? And how do we know what the rate is? And so these are called correlates or predictors of wife abuse. So correlates and predictors, we haven't really used that word yet, but you've already learned about it. when you're trying to figure out if X causes Y, the things that are correlated with Y are the correlates. And one way to describe them is as predictors. I mean, we talked earlier that it's really hard to figure out if X actually caused Y, because as we said, there could be Z's here, there could be a Z over here. And sometimes we don't need to know the real ultimate cause of something to address it. If we know what predicts it, what's correlated with it, then we can at least begin to address it in some way. So without saying what is the cause of wife abuse, we can look at what are the things that are correlated with it. And one way to think about correlation in this case is to imagine a street. Let's imagine a residential street of all these homes, a bunch of people living in homes. Tree-lined street. A term we often use in social science is all other things being equal. So if we can imagine each of these homes that are all basically equal, meaning equal income, like everybody here makes, around the same amount of money in this neighborhood. Everybody's got around the same size of family, Everybody's roughly the same class of people. It's all basically equal, but what are some differences that we might want to look for that could predict, that would help me predict. So if I'm walking down the street and I'm trying to predict which house on this street, somebody tells me one of these houses has a lot of domestic violence happening, the wife's getting beaten up all the time. You have to predict which one it is. And so this is asking, what are the things we would need to know about the houses that would help me predict it? And you have a guess?
The house, the way the property looks, maybe?
Well, I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about the variables that can be measured in terms of sociology, like on a survey. So if we ask, like the census asks things. Census doesn't ask, the census taker doesn't go, it's a well-kept home. No, but they ask how many in your home? What race and ethnicity are you? What's your income? What's your family history? Are you an immigrant? Those kinds of things. So what are the things that we can ask, they're called background variables on a survey that would help us predict which of these households have it? Well, race and ethnicity, for example, is correlated. So if you're trying to predict which house has wife abuse, if you know which house has a Latino family in it, you might want to pick that one maybe. Or a black family. Because the data tell us, the incidence and causes data, the incidence data, seem to tell us, and I should call these apparent, the data seem to tell us that if you're black or Latino, you're more likely, if you're a black or Latino woman, you're more likely to experience wife abuse. They seem to tell us that, but do we know for sure? Why might it be the case that it's what we could call an artifact of the data? Artifact of the data means sometimes the data is wrong, it's not complete. And so the data are creating a hallucination. That's the term they use nowadays with AI. Sometimes AI doesn't have all the information it needs to give you what you're asking. And so it just makes stuff up. And in the same way, if you're looking at the data on wife abuse and you're trying to figure out who does it to whom, the data is not complete, so it might make stuff up. Well, who's not calling in? So only 1/3 of domestic violence is ever called in, we think. So 2/3, 66% of the women getting beat up are not calling it in, and only 1/3 are. Could you think of reasons why Black and Latino women might be more likely to call it in than other people? Not that they're having it happen more often, just that they're more likely to report it. Or a better way to ask the question is, are there groups of people that would be very unlikely to report it? And so they're not in the data, even though it's happening to them.
Maybe the low income group of people.
So who do you think is less likely to call the police? Low income people, or if you're an upper income woman and your husband's a lawyer?
Oh, less likely?
We're trying to figure out both women get beat up. Some call up and say, hey cops, I'm getting beat up. Some don't pick up the phone.
Okay.
And we're trying to figure out who wouldn't pick up the phone. Would it be a poor woman with a poor husband, do you think? Or a rich woman with a rich husband? Who would be less likely to want to involve the cops in her household?
Rich woman.
Turns out, and you can think about why. I mean, if your husband's rich and he makes a lot of money and he's a lawyer, and you're like, I'm getting rid of this guy, I'm divorcing this guy, he beats me up every night. Calling the cops might not be in your interest, because if he loses his license to practice law, loses his fancy job making money, then when you do divorce him, you're not gonna be able to get a lot of money anymore. So from her perspective, why would I involve the cops? I'm gonna handle this myself, get out of this situation, I'm gonna take him for all he's worth. But so, it's the richer women that put on sunglasses and go to work the next day or go to the market and pretend nothing happened. But if your husband's unemployed and he's drinking and beating you up, you're like, call the cops, get this unemployed sucker out of here. So it's not that Black and Latino women maybe are getting beat up more. It's that they're more likely to have low-income husbands in our society, and be low-income themselves, and so they have less incentive, less disincentive to call the cops. In other words, another big correlate is economic, let's call it unemployment or financial problems. If I don't know anything else about these homes on the street, but I know which one of the homes did the dad recently lose his job, I might pick that house. I think that's the one that has domestic violence. Or which one was the one where the guy's in debt and he can't pay off his bills? That one? That might be the one. It's not over there.
Yeah.
Imagine. And so is that a good predictor? Unemployment, financial problems? Well, again, yes, if your husband's unemployed and has financial problems and he's beating you, you might want to call that in. But it could again be an artifact of the data, because what we're not seeing is all the richer and middle class women being beat up. Who else might not want to call it in? So we're saying richer women might not want to call it in. Other groups that might not call it in, can you think of other reasons why a woman just would not want to call the cops? He's beating me up. I can't call the police. Why would a woman do that? Can you think of measurable things we could find out about her that would help us understand that?
The family,
Like what? What kinds of families would
kids, they don't
want their kids to get in trouble? But are there specific things, certain differences about people? Maybe I'm being too vague, but what about immigration status? So for example, if you're not a fully documented immigrant and your husband's beating you up, you might not want to call the cops, because that could lead to deportation of you, your children. So you might have to just accept a few smacks to the face rather than let the cops come in. So immigrant women are one reason we think this data might not be telling us the whole story, because there might be a lot of immigrant women not calling it in. Asian families, and a lot of immigrants are Asian. Asian families are even more private. So you say, what kind of families don't report things? Well, Asian families, and a lot of them are even more private than the typical American family. So if the man there is beating people up, these women are very unlikely. Another thing is immigrants may come, even if they're fully legal in a country, they may come from a country where the police are not nice guys. I mean, if you in some super patriarchal societies, and the men come over and the man's beating the wife, they're like, we'll join in. And so a lot of women are like, I'm getting beat on by a man. I'm not going to have more men come to my house with guns. Is that how I'll feel safe? No. So especially if they've been taught that, in other countries, the police are not there to help women.
What about religious beliefs?
Yeah, well, so that can be another thing that affects privacy. And so we just don't know. So that's why we're not sure. When it comes to these two correlates of wife abuse, we're not sure, and Baca, Zinn, and Eitzen aren't sure. Are these actual correlates? Is it really the case that white women don't get beat up, that Asian women don't get beat up, or that rich women don't get beat up? Or is it just that the data is telling us that those are the only people that call it in? So what are some correlates that are better predictors, more robust That's a term we use in quantitative science. Robust means strong. So a strong predictor, like really strongly correlated to the point where we know it is a cause. So more robust predictors. One is, alcohol and other abuse. If you don't know anything else about these families, but you know which one the dad's an alcoholic, that might be the house where the violence is happening. Or some other drug addiction. I would say meth, I'm sure it's probably worse than alcohol for inducing people to be violent. And so that's a strong predictor. We know it's not a maybe, the data isn't pretending that. It really is the case. Now, you could get into more theoretical questions about, well, which men are alcoholics and which aren't, and what's the true cause of the alcoholism, and maybe there's deeper issues going on about why some men are likely to be alcoholics and others aren't. But being an alcoholic is itself a cause, a predictor, a strong predictor. Another one is family history of abuse. So again, if you don't know anything else about any of these families, but you have some data on which ones of these dads in this community, their dads beat up their mom. If you could somehow have that information, you could start predicting, I think maybe this is a household. Because it's what they call cycles of violence. And it's very hard to not repeat anything your parents did to you. I mean, I always try to be a good parent. But you end up repeating the things that were done to you almost in unconscious ways. And so especially traumatic things that were done to you. So people who were beat up by their dads are much more likely to beat up children and women in their households as well. So there again, if we go back to why are some men abusers and others not, there's deeper causes of that. But just in terms of sometimes when you're trying to figure out causes of things, the most proximate cause is the best one to focus on, maybe the closest one to the actual behavior. You could go back to deeper things, but that might not solve the problem. If we're trying to protect women, and we want to go on that street and find the guy who's doing it and stop him, then alcohol abuse or family history abuse would be very strong predictors of which guy to keep an eye on. And so where are we on time? So is that making sense what I'm saying about how the data are kind of unclear? Mainly the data is unclear because there's not enough of it. We know that a very high proportion of the domestic violence happening is not being reported. And so the data can be what's called confounding. They lead us in a certain direction that isn't exactly accurate, maybe. But what can be concluded from this analysis that they give of the incidence and causes? Again, theirs is more of an essay type of conclusion, like a lawyer, based on this evidence, here's what I conclude, not like a scientist just answering a research question. But they say what we think is that wife abuse is domestic terrorism. So now they're giving it even a new word for it. Not domestic violence or spousal abuse, not wife abuse. The term they think we should use is domestic terrorism. Why do you think they would want to use that word? What would change if we were to call it that instead of domestic violence? Or in other words, what's a different meaning? How does that change the meaning of it to call it that? What would that mean, domestic terrorism? Oh, I'm sorry, it's not even domestic terrorism. Sorry, I used the wrong term. That would be too neutral. They call it patriarchal terrorism. Sorry. Yeah, no, that's their term, patriarchal terrorism. What's the difference between calling it patriarchal terrorism and calling it domestic violence, or calling it domestic terrorism?
Like it would mean more of like the man abusing the wife, maybe?
Yeah, and why? I mean, so it isn't just calling attention to a single man beating up a single wife. they're trying to frame this issue as something that's wrong with our society. We have a patriarchal society. That's the problem. And terrorism, what's terrorism? Terrorism is like a tool people use to try and maintain things as they are. In other words, don't try to change anything, or else this will happen. Or you better change X, Y, or Z, or else this thing will happen. In other words, terrorists try to use terror, like explosions or violence, to scare people into not doing something that the terrorist doesn't want them doing. And so this idea that men are going around basically threatening women and children. Don't challenge my power. I'm the boss here. I'm the king. You better not challenge me. If you do challenge me, you're going to get this or that or that. It's just like a terrorist saying, you better get out of Palestine or we're going to go, kill you and rape you and bomb you. Or you better get out of Israel or we're going to go kill and bomb you. I'd say both sides are being terrorists in that case. And so they're saying instead of just seeing it as an individual problem, and we tend to, as a society, blame individual people for these behaviors, like, oh, he's a wife beater, he's a bad guy. But they're saying that's the wrong way to look at it, because if you look at it that way, how would you solve the problem? Well, some people say those guys need therapy. If we could just get them into some anger management, then they won't be such bad guys anymore. And that's treating a social problem as a psychological problem. If you're saying we have this domestic violence problem, but we're going to help individual men be better individual men, well, that's not going to really solve your problem, because if it's a social problem and we're raising boys every day to be wife abusers, then helping them stop being wife abusers once they become one is not a good way to solve the problem. You probably want to go to the source of the problem and try to stop people from being trained to be wife abusers in the first place. So they say we need to understand that we have a patriarchal society. And so what is the solution? More structural and cultural equality for women. What this really reflects, they're saying, is women's inequality. If women don't have equality with men, if they're not as powerful as them, then there are going to be men who use violence to maintain their power over women. And the only way to really address that, in their view, is to make sure women have the same amount of power as men. Structural, again, structure is who thinks what, and culture is who feels, structure is who has what, and culture is who thinks and feels what. And they're saying both of those are unequal in our society. Structurally, for example, the pay gap. Women make less than men still in our society. They make about 87 cents. The pay gap says 87 cents to $1. So the same work for everything, men end up getting $1 an hour for that work, and women end up getting 87 cents. Not just per hour, but what I'm saying is about 87% of what men make for the same job, women make. And, political gap. We don't have as many women with political power. We've never had a female president. We don't have that many female senators and governors. And so these are structural things that if you were to make sure there were more women making as much as men, more women with positions of authority in our schools, our governments, then men over time would begin to see women as equal, because they are. But as long as women aren't equal, they're down here, they make less, they have less power, then there's going to be men who think it's their job and right to try and keep it that way. Culturally too, more cultural equality, that would be things like, having more, women's sports being valued as much as men's sports, for example. I can't believe that the top female basketball player gets $76,000 a year, and Kevin Herter, a player for the Kings, who's not really that good, he gets like $60 million to play for the Kings and not do anything to help our team. Sorry, I used to like Kevin. So this huge pay gap, but it's not just the pay gap, it's the way we devalue and disrespect women's sports traditionally. It's changed this year in that women's basketball got really popular, and hopefully the culture will be giving women and girls as much reason to believe you can do sports, we like watching you as men. That's the kind of cultural equality I'm talking about. Having more movies where women are the heroes and the lead characters, not just the ones being saved by the men. There's lots of examples we could give of treating women with the same respect, so equal respect, not just equal pay, but equal respect and status to men. And so they think that's the way to teach boys and men to treat women with respect, is to actually, as a society, give them the equality that they should have. And if they had that equality, then there'd be fewer and fewer men each year thinking it was their right, their duty, their job to keep women down, keep them below them, and use violence as the way to do that. So again, they're giving us a conflict theory view of the problem, not a psychological view that just blames individual men and tries to figure out how we can treat them to be better men, but it's looking at our society. It's turning the angle of the camera away from the individual men who do it and asking America, well, how could you change as a society so that there's fewer and fewer men who end up being patriarchal terrorists? So does that make sense? Yeah. I don't know where we are on time. I got about 10 minutes. That finishes up my lecture on sociology of family issues. So next we're going to be turning to sociology of education, more or less. I do want to let you go a little early, but I will just tee up, as they say, the next topic so that you can think about it before we come back together again. And in the online class, I asked students to think about their own educational experiences in America. You know, what was your elementary school like? What was middle school like? What was high school like? What's Yuba College like? And what were the good things? What were the bad things? What were the challenges you faced? And where did they come from? What obstacles did you face that others put in your way or that you had trouble overcoming? And I want you to think about the functions of education, because that was a term we used earlier in the class, or it was a question we raised earlier in the class. Why do we have schools? What is the point of them? And just to remind you, as we talked about, manifest functions are the things, we're conscious of, we're aware of, they're the reasons, an average person, if you ask an average American, why do we have schools? And when I say schools and functions of schools, I'm talking about the whole education system, and that system has a rule that says you all have to go to school. In other words, it's not a choice in America. You have to go to school. If your parents, if you have kids and you're not schooling them, you're committing a crime. And so we say they have to go to school. Well, why do we say that? We talked about this earlier, and we said, well, there are things like the 3 R's. We want kids to learn basic skills, right? Why do we want basic skills? What's the function of that? Well, like we said, economic and military competition with other societies. One reason societies want to have an education system is to make sure that children growing up in it can outcompete children from other societies and outcompete them economically, like with jobs and products they make, but also outcompete them militarily with weapons and tactics and being smart. Another thing we talked about was, like citizenship. We also want to teach people basic things like the history of their country, the culture of their country, the laws of their country. We also talked about things like social skills. We expect schools to help socialize kids. In other words, teach them the basic norms and values that guide our society so that they will uphold those. And we talked about latent functions. We said even when schools aren't accomplishing their main goals, they still do other things for society. And in that sense, sociologists say even though a lot of Americans aren't happy with their schools, if I ask you, how much good was your schooling, and you might have complaints about it, and yet we still forced you to go. And so we talked about things like, babysitting. that, when child labor laws were passed, not allowing kids to work, that's when the mandatory schooling laws also got passed. So it was a choice we made as a society. We're not gonna let kids work, and we're gonna have them go to school. And also, low security prison. I mean, we're trying to keep kids off the street, really. And keep them from terrorizing the adults, so they lock them up in school all day. We also talked about the hidden curriculum. This idea that schools also teach things they don't tell you they're teaching, but they teach them nonetheless, things like subservience, just sit down and do what you're told, things like gender, like girls don't like sports, boys do, these kinds of things that schools in a subtle way try to, shape you, or the way they make, non-white students often feel less than because everything's all about the white history and the white culture. That's another kind of hidden message of the schools, or can be until recently. Anyway, but there's another manifest function that we didn't talk about, and that's the one that I want us to begin our discussion of education with. One of the things we want our schools to do is to legitimize meritocracy. Legitimize meritocracy. That's a mouthful. What does it mean to legitimize something? Well, a lot of ways I could say, but basically, humans have a tendency to claim things are true, and governments and societies say things are true about them. Like America likes to say, we are the freest society in the world. We are the most democratic society in the world. We say those things. Are they legitimate? Are they really true? We like to say we're a meritocracy. What's a meritocracy? A meritocracy is based on merit. In other words, some societies aren't based on merit. Merit is did you earn what you got? Some societies you get promoted not by earning it, but just by your blood. If you're a certain family name or a certain caste, you get to rise up. And if you're another caste or family name, you're down here. That's not a meritocracy. Those are like other kinds of ocracies. But our society, we like to claim you get where you get in America based on merit, based on hard work, in other words, that you earn your place in America. You don't get to just be president because your daddy was president. You don't get to be a sociology professor just because your daddy was a sociology professor. Mine happened to be a sociology professor, and that did help me in a lot of ways, and oftentimes it is an advantage to go into the same line of work that your dad did. But they weren't going to give me a PhD and a job here just because my dad was a sociologist. I had to earn it. I had to earn a PhD. So so we like to say that we're a meritocracy, but are we really? Did you have as much chance to be a sociologist as I do? Maybe not, even if you worked harder. So what does that mean? Do we really? So it says, when we say meritocracy, we say any person, no matter who their parents were, no matter what race, religion, gender they are, has the right to, go to school and achieve whatever they want to achieve in America. They can be anything they want to be in America. And that's what makes us better, we like to say, than other societies where people are stuck in the class or the caste that they're born into, and they have very little chance to move out of it. But we say we have a meritocracy. And how do we prove it to the rest of the world? How do we make it an actual fact instead of just a claim? It's supposedly our school system, that we have free education for all people, that now extends into community college and universities and grad school. And so we like to claim as a society, if you're willing to do the hard work of educating and going to education, you can rise up in America. But is that true? Do our schools give an equal chance to everybody, do you think? Did you have an equal chance to me to succeed? I grew up in Santa Barbara, California. I don't know where you grew up and did your schooling. If you just think about right now, this campus versus the campus in Sutter County. Are you getting as much chance to succeed here at Yuba College in Marysville as the students in Sutter County are at their Yuba College? Same college, different county, different buildings. Are they totally equal? Have you ever been over to the Sutter Center? It's way nicer than this. much happier place to be than this. And I mean, it's getting a little nicer on this campus, but just the physical surroundings of a campus can harm your ability to learn and be motivated and be engaged. But, you know, if richer kids are getting better schools with nicer grounds, nicer teachers, nicer computers, and poorer kids are getting crappy schools with crappy grounds and crappy stuff, then we're not equally giving all students the chance to succeed. So, but those are things to think about, and we'll come back on next week to talk about the American education system and its inequalities. And yeah, all right, well, have a good weekend.